Hi everyone, I'm Tony Lyons, and welcome back to the CG Compositing series. In the last video, we talked about kind of a simple way to divide a render into diffuse and specular and emission passes, and today we're going to be diving one level deeper and talking about direct and indirect passes, the next level of complexity that you can break down your CG renders into. If we look at this visualization again of the kind of buckets of diffuse and specular, before we kind of covered a simple view of it, which was just diffuse and spec and emission, and we're going now to an intermediate and one level deeper in describing some of the components that make up diffuse and specular. These include direct and indirect passes, along with a few other components that you might find along the way that go into these diffuse and specular buckets. So let's talk specifically about direct and indirect lighting passes. So we'll just start off with direct. So what is direct lighting? Direct lighting is when a light source directly illuminates the surface. This could be considered the first bounce, or the first time the light ray is hitting a surface. So if you shoot a ray of light from the light source, the first time it hits the wall, that will be considered direct lighting. So you could say that that pixel or that spot on the object is within the direct view of the light source and is receiving some of that light. This kind of lighting pass is very simple to render because there's not much calculation that needs to be done. It's kind of am I within view of the light source or not? And it gives you an image like you see here, which is very contrasted, and it just kind of is the bare bones, like things that are in view of the light source or not. So what is indirect lighting? Indirect lighting is all the subsequent bounces of light, all the light bounces that are after the first bounce. This can be simply known as bounce lighting. Light is often diffused throughout the whole scene and will also pick up some of the surface's colors. So you can see in this image, I guess the wall that was transparent on the right side was green. In the previous image, we couldn't see that it was green, but you could see, for example, in this chrome reflection that it's reflecting the green wall that we're kind of seeing through at the moment. But once the lighting was in the room and is bouncing around, then we can see that the bounce light from that green wall has entered the shot in a way, and that is the benefit of the indirect lighting. And that is much more realistic to what would happen in real life, which would be that the light hits the green wall and then there's, green spill going everywhere into the scene. So here's a couple more visualizations of direct and indirect lighting passes. So on the left side here, we have a beauty render, and that is split into direct pass, which we mentioned was, when the light is directly hitting the source, and then a separate pass, which is the indirect pass, which is all the bounce lighting after the first bounce. So it's not including the first bounce, it's just all the ones that are happening after that. And those two passes are combined and you get this nice beauty render. Here are some examples of direct and indirect lighting in real life. On the left side, you have like a spotlight that's directly over a bowl and is receiving a lot of harsh light, harsh shadows. And on the right side, all the kind of LED lights on the ceiling are pointed upwards, and the whole scene is illuminated by basically bounce lighting. There's a few lights on the ceiling that are pointing down, but in general, it's sort of a more ambient, more evenly lit environment, which is what you would get with indirect bounce lighting. To calculate the direct lighting pass, the computer uses a technique called Raytracing. Raytracing is a render calculation used to find direct lighting, shadows, and specular highlights. Instead of calculating from the light source outwards in every direction in the scene, it saves time by going from the render camera backwards, only needing to calculate the light rays hitting the camera, and necessary for creating the final rendered image. It starts from a pixel on the final render and follows the light path back until it reflects off or through a surface or material. It then asks, am I directly illuminated by a light source? And if so, follows the path back to the light source and determines the distance, intensity, and color of the light hitting the surface. If the area is not hit by direct light, it just renders as black. This calculation ends after the first bounce, so it is not calculating bounce light. Here on the left side, you can see an illustration of the lights kind of shooting backwards through the pixels of the final image until it hits the surface, and then trying to trace the light ray back to the light source to determine if the object is getting hit by a light and what color and intensity that light should be. On the right side is an example of a direct light only pass, and you can see that most of the image is registering as black, but the light source is above the stairway and it's shining down, and we're seeing what is actually directly lit by that light source. So again, it's kind of asking the question, am I directly illuminated by a light source or not? And that's the render that you're getting. Global illumination, or GI for short, involves various techniques to calculate the indirect lighting that occurs when light bounces around a scene. This process helps subtly illuminate shadowed areas and contributes to the overall color and intensity of the scene, especially around areas that are hit by the direct lighting. There are often many number of bounces allowed, depending on render time and settings, and each bounce inherits the color from objects and materials that it's bouncing off of, and further distributes light into the scene. The result is a more realistic and natural-looking shot, as it mimics the complex ways light interacts in the real world. I actually found an amazing video by Josh's channel, or at Josh's handle. It's called How Raytracing Modern CGI Works and How to Do It 600 Times Faster. I thought this did a really good job of explaining the video. It's a much longer video, but I'm just going to play a clip of it so you get the idea. I really encourage you to go watch the entire video if you're interested in learning more of kind of like the technical know-how of how the render is actually forming the image that we're seeing and sort of kind of the calculations that the computer is doing behind the scenes. Let's play the part of the video where he explains what ray tracing is.
Ray tracing replicates this. It creates many mathematical objects called rays, emitting them from light sources and seeing where they intersect objects in the scene. When they do, other rays are randomly fired from the points of intersection, hitting other points where other rays are emitted, repeating until the rays hit the simulated camera. The original color of the light and the color of the surfaces the rays hit determines what color of light has arrived at the camera. The exact spot the camera is hit determines where on the image that color goes. If multiple rays hit the same spot, their colors are averaged together. The more rays we fire, the brighter and less grainy the image gets. If you've taken pictures with an old film camera, you may be familiar with this effect, where long exposure times are required to get an image that isn't noticeably grainy.
Okay, so keep in mind the last part of what he says there about how it has to shoot many rays in order to prevent the render from being very grainy. So yeah, I thought this was a amazing visual representation of what ray tracing is, and pretty much sums it up in about a minute. So please go watch Josh's channel, the YouTube video How Ray Tracing Works and How to Do It 600 Times Faster, if you want to know more about the subject. We are recently seeing the emergence of real-time ray tracing and global illumination in a lot of game engines. And there's a lot more powerful graphics cards coming out from NVIDIA, for example, the RTX series. I'm sure you've heard of the RTX 3090 and the 4090 that everybody tries to get their hands on because it is just great for rendering and also for real-time ray tracing, which makes games feel, I don't know, more interactive and more realistic because it's like live light bouncing in the scene. All these real-time indirect lighting calculations are what are bringing attention to Unreal Engine and Unity, for example, because the results are just so realistic and so fast. So I wanted to shed some light, no pun intended, on ray tracing and global illumination and indirect lighting in general and how important it is to realism of the scene. And that'll help us understand how and why to adjust it in our comps. With the further division of passes also means that there are more ways to combine the passes together. So generally speaking, you find kind of two options. Either you divide it into diffuse and specular and then add them together. So we have direct diffuse and indirect diffuse on one side and direct specular and indirect specular on the other side. Or you can find yourself dividing it into direct and indirect lighting. So direct diffuse and direct specular on one side, and indirect diffuse and indirect specular on the other side. I would say that the diffuse and specular separation is in general more common to see and probably more useful as a compositor because we are talking about material qualities in diffuse and specular, as we mentioned in the material pass. But there are some cases where you might want to kind of separate the direct and indirect lighting to do different things. So we can get into that, and let's jump into Nuke now to see. So in this next section, we're going to be looking at the fruit ball render that is rendered in 3 different renderers. And the reason I'm looking at multiple renders is to show you what that pass looks like in that render, and also to familiarize yourself with how some of the different renderers might be naming the direct and indirect passes along with the diffuse and the specular. They all kind of have their own naming conventions. So first we're going to be focusing on this kind of approach, this more common separation of diffuse and specular. We're going to use the Redshift fruit bowl render first as our starting point. So if you remember our simple example, we can separate this beauty render into 3 areas. So diffuse, specular, and emission. And so those are our main components that are material AOVs. And then we just plus them all together to get back the beauty. So if I called the diffuse specular emission level 1 or the simple version, we've sort of expanded and upgraded to level 2, which the diffuse, specular, and emission areas are still there, but we've separated them into more complex passes. And you can see here I'm sort of labeling the different passes as intermediate now, which they do get plus together into still diffuse, specular, and emission. So we're sort of blowing them up here and expanding them, but once they're plus together, they are, again, matching the simple one, if that makes sense. So we're dividing them up here in this intermediate level. And in the Redshift render, it is called diffuse lighting, which is diffuse direct, and GI. And remember, GI is global illumination. So this is the diffuse bounce lighting here. We have another pass, which is the subsurface scattering. So once any object has a material with subsurface scattering, that is going to be broken out into its own pass because that is its own calculation. It requires a little bit more render power or so. And so it's done kind of on the side, and you, I guess, get that pass for free. So we're also going to include that in the diffuse section because it belongs with the diffuse. So we can see we have our direct diffuse, and these objects are black for now. And I could switch these actually, just so it makes it a little easier. So now we have all of our, what you would say, direct diffuse pass. So it's the diffuse lighting plus the subsurface scattering. And then we have our GI. So we can see we had the emission object here, and we are getting that bounce lighting. Also underneath the fruit bowl and on the sides of the fruit, we can see that the environment is bouncing light, and we are getting more illuminated now. This is still just the diffuse section. Now let's take a look at the specular section. So we have what is called specular lighting. That is what this render is calling it, the Redshift renderer. So specular lighting is the direct specular. So all of these specular highlights are the initial bounce of the light. It is reflecting the lights of the scene, okay? So there's no additional bounces going on. So we're just seeing whatever the light's hitting, those are the specular highlights of those areas and those materials. And then we have reflections. Now, of course, this is a bit confusing because reflections and specular, it all kind of sounds like the same thing, right? But in this case, this reflections, I believe, is referring to indirect specular. So this is all the other bounces. So it's not reflecting the lights. Now, I know we have this emission material here. It's not considered a light. So it's just treating it as like an emissive material that then gets bounced around. So that's why you don't see it in this initial specular lighting. Although probably you could, set it up as a light and get it to show up in the initial specular lighting. I guess we weren't smart enough to do that. So it shows up in this secondary specular reflections here. And you can kind of see what it is because all these little specular reflections, they're bouncing the fruit colors off of each other and only showing up in a little bit of areas here. So you can see this this area on the underside of the bowl is the light bouncing off the table, and then the table illuminating the underside of the bowl. So that is kind of the explanation of what the Redshift render is calling reflections. So again, we are looking for what the render is calling diffuse and specular and indirect and direct. So we are literally looking for indirect specular and direct specular. And so this is the naming of that for this render. So you see specular lighting and reflections. So we have the diffuse section and the specular section. And again, the emission doesn't get separated. So it all boils down to those three again. So you kind of have these layers of separation so we can turn off, the different passes. And we're turning off the indirect diffuse pass, which is just called global illumination in this case. So that is the Redshift example. So that was how to separate the diffuse in specular, indirect, and direct passes in the Redshift render here. But as we talked about, there was this way to separate it as direct lighting and indirect lighting. So we'll take a look at that within the Redshift render as well. So again, this is a less common variation, so direct and indirect separation. But here we're using the same passes that we just saw, but we're separating this into diffuse lighting and specular lighting in this case. So you can see this is the direct diffuse and the direct specular, and we're adding those together. So you could say that this result is our direct lighting. Also, all of the initial bounces of the light on our CG. It looks a bit strange because some of these fruits are black, and that is because the subsurface scattering is still separated, but we can leave that on the side for now. So this would be the direct lighting, and now we can take a look at the indirect lighting, which would be the GI pass, which was the indirect diffuse, and the reflections, which was the indirect specular. And if you combine those together, you can see kind of the difference. So we have our direct passes here, our direct lighting, and our indirect lighting. And again, what this is all the bounce lighting of the scene. And we're going to consider that the emission object was not a light, and it's just now bouncing into the scene, which is why it appears in the bounce lighting. So then you could add the indirect lighting on top of the direct lighting, and our subsurface scattering would also go in there. Our emission also goes in the end, and we still make up our beauty render, right? So this is a possibility. You probably don't see that very often, but for example, maybe I want to bring up the amount of indirect lighting or bring down the amount of indirect lighting. So I'm able to do it now with just one grade node, which is pretty useful for this case. Over in the sort of normal separation of diffuse and spec, you could still do the same thing. So say I wanted to grade all of the indirect passes, I could just make a grade, but then you run into the issue, I guess, that you have to clone the grade or expression link it or so. But you could, if I look at the end of the result, you still get the same result where I have control now over just the indirect. So perhaps it depends on what kind of color corrections or areas you're going to be adjusting the most in your comp. But it is very well possible if you're not just having one grade node adjusting things above it, you could, of course, expression link or clone a color correction or grade node to affect the indirect or the direct separately. All right, so that was the Redshift example. We're going to continue on because you're going to notice that the names start changing depending on what renderer you're using. So it's very, very important. You are probably going to have a renderer that is spitting out a name, or perhaps your lighting department has decided on a naming convention that is completely different than these names here. And don't get confused. We are looking for diffuse and specular and direct and indirect lighting. So that is what we're looking for, and we're gonna find it, and we're gonna maybe have a little guesswork of it. And that's not something that you should be afraid of, okay? That should be that you know what to expect, you know what you're able to get from CG, and then try to figure out, okay, what am I looking at here? Is this the direct diffuse? Is this the indirect diffuse? Is it the direct specular, indirect specular? And as long as you understand what those are, then you'll be able to identify them in whatever CG render that you're going to get. Let's move on to the Arnold examples here. And so again, we have our simple example, the diffuse specular emission. So okay, nothing new there. So what does Arnold call these passes? So we have, here we go, diffuse direct. So it's pretty obvious what that is. It's a direct diffuse pass. And here we have diffuse indirect. And so it's pretty obvious what that is as well. And our SSS, that is our subsurface scattering. Now, for whatever reason, we, I don't know, didn't turn on the material for the subsurface scattering in the Arnold render. That's our fault. Sorry about that. But you can see what a subsurface scattering would look like. Would look like something like this on the side. But that's not really important. Just know that we kind of made a mistake there. But so it actually makes it a little bit easier here. So we have our diffuse direct and diffuse indirect. I find that the Arnold naming convention is very easy to understand what's going on, which is what I was kind of basing the other assumptions for the other renders off of. So if we move on to the specular section, we have the specular direct and the specular indirect. So again, these naming conventions on Arnold are super, super clear. At least out of the box, we were using Cinema 4D in this case. Your lighting department might be using Arnold and might be changing the names of these passes. But we can see that these are the default names in this case, and then we have emission there. But let's take a look at this. We have our Arnold specular direct pass. The light hit the objects in the scene, and this is the first bounce, and it's hitting the camera. So this is exactly what we're getting, reflecting the lights in the scene. No additional bounces, okay? If we go back to our Redshift example, we're gonna load that up, and we're gonna load up the specular direct from the Arnold example. Now we can see that these are, they're a little different, okay? But they're essentially the same pass. And yes, there's some shading issues, and we're reflecting some HDR maybe in one of them. But you can see that this is what the pass is. So that is how I know pretty confidently that the specular lighting is the direct specular pass, and that this reflections pass is going to be the same as the specular indirect. You see, they look very similar, other than a few, shading render differences. So that is how I'm identifying that the Redshift is calling the indirect specular reflections. And the same with the GI. So the GI pass, if we go down, we have our diffuse indirect here from Arnold. And we can see, other than the fruits that are involved because of the subsurface scattering thing, that these are intended to be the same pass. So the GI pass in Redshift is the indirect diffuse. I hope this is making sense. We'll look at one more example. First, let's break out the Arnold pass into the direct and indirect lighting. So we have the diffuse direct and specular direct. I think this one is the most clear example. So here we go. Here's all of our direct lighting. And then we have our specular indirect and diffuse indirect. And those combine into all of our indirect lighting. So again, we'll compare it back to our Redshift render. So this is the Redshift render and Arnold render, the indirect lighting. You can see they're pretty similar in how it's doing it. Then we're going to plus the indirect lighting onto the direct lighting. And finally, we're going to plus the emission pass there. And we end up, again, with our beauty render. So again, just a variation of the Arnold setup. So instead of dividing everything into diffuse spec emission, we've divided into direct lighting, indirect lighting, and emission, I guess, in this case, along with subsurface scattering, which should be there, but is not. And finally, let's get to Octane. So this is our Octane render. I know they all look the same, but we have our simple example, diffuse spec emission. So here we go. All right. So we have diffuse spec emission there, and let's see what Octane likes to call these. So we have some similar naming here. So diffuse direct, diffuse indirect. So here, I guess we had some, again, all the scenes, because the renderers are different, you have to kind of set them up again, and some of the materials get a little bit mixed up. But in this case, it's considering some of the lights that we had indirect. So this one looks a little bit different, but you can still tell that it's indirect lighting. And then we have our subsurface scattering, which again was empty in this case. Notice that the other passes were SSS, and in the Octane render, it is actually calling it subsurface scattering. So it's helping us out there. Even though it was very helpful to name it diffuse direct and diffuse indirect, we have a bit of a maybe discrepancy. So instead of saying specular direct and specular indirect, it's just calling it reflection direct and reflection indirect, right? So it can be a little bit confusing with the namings because you would expect the word specular to be there, but it's using the word reflection in Octane. However, in the Redshift example, it's using the word reflections for the indirect specular. So again, it's all depending on your renderer, what it's choosing to name things, and everyone's creative at naming their passes differently. And if you're in doubt, you could ask your lighting department which one is the direct and indirect specular highlight if they do render you a separation of them. Finally, we'll take the Octane render and divide it into direct lighting and indirect lighting. So here's our direct lighting and our indirect lighting in this case. It is a bit strange that the lights show up there. It could be a problem with how we set up the lights in this one, but it's supposed to be indirect lighting. And then we add the emission, and we have our rebuild of the beauty. So there we have the fruit ball rendered in 3 different renderers, Redshift, Arnold, and Octane. And we have rebuilt it in 2 different ways, one respecting diffuse specular emission and the other separating it into direct lighting and indirect lighting. But I won't just trust my renders here. I have a couple other examples. You can download these kind of Foundry CG rebuild renders from the Foundry website. And in the toolset in Nuke in 2D, you have your CG beauty, which is going to spit out what you see here. So I didn't make this. This is just what comes in Nuke for you to play around with. And there they're expecting an Arnold. So here we can see, what the Foundry has named it, or whatever renderer that they were using has named it. We have direct diffuse, indirect diffuse, direct specular, indirect specular. This scene is rather simple, so sometimes it can be a little bit hard to see what's going on. But here you have your diffuse and your specular, and you add them together. So they have a moto render here, and we can see illumination direct, so that would be diffuse direct, and illumination indirect, that would be diffuse indirect, and then specular, which would be direct specular, and reflection, which would be indirect specular. Now we have RenderMan, direct diffuse, indirect diffuse, direct specular, indirect specular. Thank you, RenderMan, for making some nicely named passes here for us. Then we have a VRay render, which we see lighting, GI, which is indirect, reflect, and refract. So I think it is just in this case, this is the direct diffuse, this is the indirect diffuse, and it did not separate the specular into direct and indirect. It's just combined and is called reflect. I do have a better VRay example here. It's the VRay teapot scene. I got it from Luca Mignardi. He's got a website here. He's talking about 2.5D relighting, and he's giving us a render. And in this case, you can see VRay lighting, VRay specular, global illumination, and VRay reflection. So we could kind of switch these around if we wanted to. VRay lighting and global illumination, that's your direct diffuse and indirect diffuse. So this is our complete diffuse here. You can see what we're doing. And then we have our VRay specular, direct specular, and VRay reflection, which would be indirect specular. And then we combine those to get all of the specular. And then we have our diffuse plus our specular here, making up the final render. So again, I'm just showing you more renders so you can see that there's more than one way to name these things. However, that we're looking for the same things in all of these renders, okay? So that is sort of the point I'm proving. We have a very nice VRay render here. And in this case, what did we have? We had diffuse and specular and reflection. And reflection was indirect specular. and the diffuse is rendered already, and we can already tell because we can see the underside of this chair. It was rendered with direct and indirect diffuse together at once, and it's just called diffuse. I'm sure there's an option in VRay where you can check. In fact, you know that there is because it says lighting here in global illumination and this other render. So there's, a checkbox, and whoever made this render just didn't pick the checkbox. So it all shows up in one pass called diffuse. It's highlighting another point, which is that it's not always going to be separated, All right, I hope I didn't go on for too long. I just wanted to kind of make the point that all of these renders are naming things differently. The lighters might be naming the passes differently. They're not always checking to export every single pass. So you have to do a little bit of detective work to kind of rebuild these things in some cases. It's not that complicated because, again, we are just looking for, at this moment, these 4 passes or these bigger buckets of diffuse in spec. And hopefully on your projects, the lighting department is going to be always rendering things in the same way. So however they decide to separate these passes, or if you ask them to separate passes a certain way and name them a certain thing, the hope is that once you have a set, like a template or a setup like this, that every render that they make you is going to fit into this template. So the theory would be, if you're a lead or a supervisor or something, then you would just set up this template and tell them to basically always render the same thing for you. Yes, you have to find out a little bit some detective work and what the passes are called at the beginning, but then it should be easier as things move forward, as long as you're communicating with your lighting department and they're rendering the same stuff. If you're just an artist, yeah, it might be a pain to figure out what everything is. Hopefully there's a CG template already at your studio, but at least you'll know what to look for and what to adjust. We've learned what the direct and indirect passes are, and also how to identify them, how they might be named certain things that are different depending on which renderer you're using or what lighting department is naming them. So we can now identify what direct and indirect passes are. But more importantly, how can we use them in compositing? So how does having direct and indirect passes benefit us as compositors when doing our comp? Well, the first and most obvious use case would be contrast and color correction. Because the indirect pass is often boosting information or detail in the shadow, we can use the indirect or the direct pass to have individual control over the mids and lows and the highlights of our shot. This gives more flexibility over the color correction in order to increase or decrease contrast and better match CG to a plate. In order to demonstrate the color correction part, I'm going to be using this little Blender render that I rendered out of a little diorama of a room. Interior shots are usually pretty good at showing direct and indirect because usually the light's coming in from a window source and then bouncing around the room. So it makes it a pretty good example for this. So I just have a basic setup separating the direct lighting and the indirect lighting. Here is the direct lighting of the scene, and here is the indirect lighting. You can see this is all the bounce light, and it is pretty dark, but we can boost it up, for example, to see what is really going on. So if I were to try to increase the contrast of this room just based off of the beauty here, the beauty render, so say I didn't have anything separated, there's a couple ways to increase contrast. First, you could mess around with the white point, black point, so you're essentially slanting the curve a bit more or kind of crushing the image a bit. So yeah, you could increase the contrast this way. Another way to do it would be to multiply up while you gamma down a little bit and finding kind of the balance there. So you can see original, I'm not doing too much there, so let's just bring it down. But yeah, you can see I'm increasing a bit the contrast of the image. But you will have in both of these kind of cases kind of limiting results because everything is baked together, both the indirect and the direct. So the shadows are kind of, predefined or so, or the relationship between the where the light hits in the shadowed areas. The same with decontrast. You would just do kind of opposite. So if you bring these guys further apart or if you were to multiply down while gamming up a bit, you can start to get a kind of washed out type of image. So we're a bit limited about what we can do to the beauty render. When we separate direct and indirect lighting, we can start getting some more interesting results. Remember that the indirect lighting is all the bounce lighting. It's basically all the light that's bouncing into the shadowed areas of the shot. The direct lighting in this case has plenty of light, so we don't want to mess with that too much because that's going to change the overall intensity of the scene. So we're going to focus mostly on adjusting and increasing and decreasing the indirect lighting. So I've stuck a grade node here on the indirect lighting, and we're just going to increase or decrease the intensity of that. So you can see if I start increasing the intensity, I'm starting to get some interesting results. So I'm spilling more bounce light into the scene. Let's see if I can disable that. So it's really boosting the mids in a more natural way than you might get from just a color correction over everything. Then I'll bring these back to normal. And if I decrease it, you also see, probably most notably kind of around this area, you can see things starting to get a little bit more contrasted in this way because there's less bounce lighting entering the corners and bouncing up off the table. So this could be, an interesting way to balance a shot a little bit differently and give you some more interesting results, for example. So I'm going to duplicate the grade from the indirect lighting, and I'm going to put it over on the direct lighting. I'm going to expression link the two, and I'm going to set the grade on the direct lighting to be reversed. So whatever I do on one side, it's going to have the reversed effect. So if I increase this, it's going to darken on the direct lighting, and if I decrease this, it's going to brighten it. Now, I don't want to affect the direct lighting that much, so I'm actually going to limit this to maybe, 20%. So it's not having as strong as an effect, but still having some. Okay, so if I go back and adjust this original multiply, as I said, as I increase this one, the other one will decrease a bit. And so I am going to be increasing the indirect lighting and decreasing the direct lighting, which is going to be decontrasting. So shadows are coming up and then the highlights are going down. So it's bringing them closer together and decontrasting. You can see if I start bringing this up a lot, I start to get some interesting results. So this was the normal color correction of the decontrast over the beauty, and this is what we have here. Maybe this is not exactly what we want, but it is an alternative way to rebalance the highlights and shadows. And adding contrast would just be lowering the indirect lighting so it goes close to 0, and just slightly increasing the direct lighting. So maybe I'm going a bit too high there. I could lower the effect on the direct lighting, but we can see the result is a more punchy image. So a little bit darker shadows and a little bit punchier highlights. So I just wanted to demonstrate how you might use the direct and indirect lighting to add or remove contrast. And keep in mind the stronger color correction is usually happening on the indirect lighting, at least in this case, in my example. Color corrections could work in a very similar type of way. Of course, I could try to color correct the midtones or the shadows of this shot by color correcting the gamma and trying to make it a bit more blue, but it's going to be not too precise and kind of overall. But we can try to do the same thing using the direct and indirect lighting separate. So I'm going to go into my direct lighting. I'm going to put a little bit of a warmer color correction on it, not too much, but I'm just warming things up a little bit. And I'm doing the opposite now to the indirect lighting, where I'm going to cool it down. And I'll put a stronger color correction there. I'm sure I can increase this. Let's just make this kind of blue to notice the result of it. And I'll add those together. So I'll disable the effect. And you can see, especially around this table here, I'm kind of adding the warm and cool push from the shadows and the highlights. So, this is all depending on aesthetics, or perhaps your plate has cooler shadows than what you're getting in the renderer. And this could be a way to go in and adjust those shadows or midtones from the indirect pass in your CG render to match closer to what's going on in the plate. The next way we could use direct or indirect passes is for filters and effects. For example, adding glow filters to the direct lighting pass to punch the lighting and adding some realistic camera lens effects. There's really no limit to the imagination here. I'm just using glow as a pretty obvious filter that you could use, but I'm just putting all in this section using direct or indirect lighting passes to drive other effects and filters. For this effects and filters example, I just went back into the scene and turned off some of the additional lights inside of the room so that it was more obvious that there is kind of one light source, the sunlight, and then bouncing into this room. I have the same setup as before, and let's just say we punched up the indirect lighting here, so it's kind of, I don't know, moonlit scene or something. If I wanted to give the scene a little bit more sunlight pop, maybe I would want to glow only the direct lighting of where the light hits. So instead of all this indirect lighting, maybe I only want to glow exactly where the lighting is hitting the walls and tables and furniture. If I were to glow overall, then I might end up something like this, which is just like a glowy version of what we already have. But if I plug in the glow to just the direct only, now we're getting the glow isolated to only where the sunlight is hitting. It's only going to be glowing this information, and even if I gain this up all the way, you can see there is really no other spill because it's only giving you where the direct lighting has hit and not the additional bounces. So adding the glow back over the room would look something like this, where again, if I were to plug the glow into everything, maybe it would get a little bit too bright in areas that I didn't want because I wanted to just be the areas that are being hit by light as the ones that are being glowed. So just to extend this example farther, I'm going to streak the lighting a little bit and kind of add that over. And again, if I were to plug this into the overall, maybe I'm streaking or getting a little bit too much glow over everything. And so we can really isolate where we're doing the glow without needing to do any, I don't know, additional Luma key pass or anything like that. So I'm just going to toggle back and forth. So you can see that the glow is kind of being isolated and directed only to where the lighting is hit from the direct lighting pass. Now, sometimes we can use the direct lighting or indirect lighting to pull a key. For example, we mentioned that the beauty render is a combination of both direct and indirect, so there is bounce light in the shadow, but the direct light is only where the light's hitting, so there's almost a natural key of anything that's being hit by light. So perhaps instead of keying with a Luma key the entire image, so we could crunch that a bit, and the more we crunch, we're starting to pick up on the details from the indirect lighting. We could instead maybe pull a key on just the direct lighting, and that allows us to not pull as crunchy of a key, and maybe give us a little bit better results. So here's kind of the before and after. And you could use this Luma key to drive other effects, or, I mean, it kind of looks like a cool comic book frame or something right now. But yeah, I mean, it could be used for anything. So it's just an example of ways to use these passes, where they might come in handy for you for any number of effects that you might use. The final and probably most important reason to have the direct and indirect passes separated is for denoising CG. Now, we took a look earlier in the video about how easy it was to render direct lighting passes. It's either is the light hitting this object or not. But the indirect passes and subsurface scattering are very expensive renders and often arrive with some unwanted render noise and chattering. So the direct lighting pass can be calculated pretty quickly, but the indirect pass, it really depends on your render settings and how long you let the render run for so it can calculate the samples. And the longer you let it run, the more detail and less noise will amount in the final render. So very often lighting departments are shaving some of that render time in order to get the renders out to the compositor on time. And we as compositors need to have a solution for some of that noisy renders. And all of that noise, generally speaking, is happening in the indirect passes and the subsurface scattering. So instead of applying a denoise technique to the whole beauty render, we can apply those denoise techniques only to the necessary passes and can help preserve details and improve the final quality of your renders in comp. Let's take a look at this problem and go over some different ways that we could denoise the CG. So when I rendered out this room, I had some low samples and I had to increase the samples quite a bit and increase the render time. The render on the right here took about, 20 or 30 minutes, and the one on the left took maybe 5 hours or something like that. I just let it run kind of overnight. But you can see quite a big difference, especially in these kind of reflection areas. Also in the subsurface scattering of this plant, you can see one is a lot smoother than the other. On the bounce lighting of this windowsill, you can see it's much more evened out and less grainy. And this is just a result of the samples and the render time. So if I were to compare the low sample render to the high sample render, if I look at just the direct lighting, you can see, yes, it's cleaned up some of the noise in some areas, but for the most part, it looks pretty similar to each other. There's a little bit more shadows, clean up some of the noise on the book. Probably the biggest difference between the low sample and the high sample is in these plants with the subsurface scattering, because that has to do its own scattering calculation and is not as easy to calculate as, say, the light hitting the wall. But when I take a look at the indirect lighting from the low sample versus the indirect lighting from the high sample, it is night and day. There is a lot more cleanup happening in the samples, and that's just because the light is bouncing around and it's able to sample more bounces and get a cleaner result and be able to bounce more and go into more corners. And you can really see it with these kind of reflections. And, if the settings were even higher and it went on for even longer, probably the room would be even cleaner. But notice how big of a change this is compared to the direct lighting change, which was, yes, in a couple areas, but this has a very high level of noise that was able to be smoothed out. So every single frame of a moving CG render is going to have its own kind of grain pattern because the samples are randomly scattered and they're all showing up a little bit differently. So on a moving image, it's going to show up as this grainy noise. It's going to be most obvious in, say, the shadows or the corners of the room. And I have this subsurface chocolate gnome that's in the scene, and the subsurface is also giving us some problems with all the graininess there. And thank you to Valentin and Nicolini for providing this Cornell render box example. Alright, so we have a noisy render, but you have to remember that the beauty render is a combination of a bunch of layers, and some of those layers are problematic and causing the render noise, but others are clean and are not causing the noise. So it's good to separate those out and to know where to apply your denoise and where not to. If I take a look at this direct lighting area, the diffuse direct and the specular direct, you can see that it's super clean. It's a very easy render to calculate, and so there's hardly any noise in it whatsoever. Here's the indirect lighting, so the diffuse indirect and the specular indirect, and you can see that a lot of the noise is being held in this one pass, especially for the entire room. The subsurface scattering pass of the chocolate gnome, you have to notice that both the subsurface direct and the subsurface indirect, they're both very noisy. So if I take a look at this, subsurface direct and the subsurface indirect are both containing a lot of noise. And the reason for that is because it requires a lot more samples and scatterings so that the light can scatter within the gnome and within the material. And so it's less accurate because it needs to calculate for longer. So when you have low settings, it's going to show up like this. It's very common on creatures or animals or humans that the subsurface scattering pass has quite a lot of noise in it. So I've grouped all of these problem layers, all the layers with the most noise together. So we have the indirect lighting, subsurface scattering, and this transmission. The direct lighting pass we're not going to touch because there wasn't really anything wrong with it, so we don't want to muddy the image further by trying to manipulate this pass. For the first example, we're just going to use a normal Nuke Denoise. I just sampled the background wall and adjusted the settings. Here I have the settings open so you can take a look at what I changed. But you can already see from the left side, which was the original, to the after the denoise, you can see a pretty big difference. It's doing a pretty good job, much smoother from the original result. Here on the left side, I have the original render, and on the right side is with the Nuke Denoise applied to the layers and then recombined to equal the beauty. And we can see that we're getting a pretty good result. The Nuke Denoise might be the first thing you try. You don't need any additional plugin or tool, so it's a pretty good option. It's giving us decent results. And I want to show the difference between denoising the entire beauty render versus only denoising the problem layers. So here on the right side is a denoise over everything, and when I wipe it, you'll see more detail comes back, and that is because mainly that the direct lighting passes don't need to be denoised, so we're able to avoid any type of corruption or artifacting on those passes. So we're able to keep more of the details. So more of the shape and structure is kept, and that's really important. So we don't want to denoise things that are not necessary because that'll result in a loss of detail where we don't need it to happen. The second thing you could try is the Neat Video Denoiser. Now, Neat Video Denoiser is a paid plugin, but it's one of the best denoisers in the game. We constantly use it for plates and such. It does a particularly good job with the noisiness on the CG, and it's a better result than the native Nuke one. It is very expensive. It took a while even for this to cache up on my machine, so it's very heavy. If you're using this, probably you want to pre-render this area, especially if you're duplicating this plugin everywhere. But it certainly is a great result. I mean, this gnome is barely doing any type of noise pattern now. It's very smooth and it looks very good. So definitely an option worth trying if you have very noisy CG to try giving the Neat Video a try. Here's the original render and the Neat Denoise result on the right side. You can see it's a much cleaner looking render. You can really make out all the details in the shadows and on the gnome. The last denoise technique I'd like to talk about is called the Motion Vector Denoise. In order to use this, we'll need to render out a Motion Vector utility pass. That's what you can see on this left side here is the Motion Vector Pass. And what the Motion Vector Pass basically is analyzing the frame before and after when the camera in this case is moving, and it's telling you approximately where that pixel is going from one frame to the next. A motion vector pass consists of red and green channels, and red is corresponding to the X movement, so the left and right movement, and the green channel is corresponding with the up and down movement or the Y axis in a 2D sense. And you'll notice that some of these pixels are negative and some are positive. A positive value in the red channel means that a pixel will move to the right of screen, and a negative value in the red channel will mean that a pixel will move to the left of screen. And in the green channel, it's corresponding up and down, and a positive value will move it up, and a negative value will move it down. In other words, every pixel is a vector, and a vector is both a direction and an amount. So it knows the direction by combining which combination of left, right, up, or down it is. So it finds, I guess, the angle of it. And the amount would just be how high or low the numbers are, telling you how far the pixel will go. So how does the motion vector pass come into this denoise? How are we going to use it? Now, a lot of times you might be working at a studio that has their own tool for this. There are some online that I'll show you in a second, but I'd like to break down what these tools are doing and kind of the concept behind them. In order to demonstrate this, I'm just going to do it on the beauty render first. So we have our motion vectors pass shuffled out, and I'm going to shuffle it in. You can see in the setup, I just have it shuffled off to the side. I'm going to inject the red and the green channel from the motion vectors into the forward U and forward V in order to use it for distortion. So the motion vector pass allows us to see where the pixel is going from frame to frame. It's telling us what direction it's heading. So we're actually able to take the next frame and move those pixels to roughly be what the current frame is and the previous frame, and move those to be what the current frame is. And I'll show you that right now. So I have a little setup here that is showing the current frame and the next frame and previous frame by just using a time offset set to 1 and -1. So even though I'm on frame 14, which is the current frame, if I look at this time offset -1, it'll say frame 15. And if I look at time offset with 1, it'll say frame 13. So previous, current, and next. Now we shuffled our motion vectors into the forward channel, which means that these time offsets are also going to be moving around this forward channel. So if I look at the forward channel of each of these, you can see that it's moving them along in time as well. So it's picking up those frames motion vectors pass. We very often see motion vectors being used for motion blur, but you could just use them with a simple iDistort. So I'm going to make an iDistort and set it to use the forward channels, which is our motion vectors. And I'm just going to set this to start scaling back using those motion vectors. And if I compare, so I have it set to 2, and if I compare the current frame with the next frame, you can see that it's now aligning in the background. And yeah, we're getting some weird artifacts, and that's just the nature of the parallax, and it's not able to kind of fix those edges. But you can see a kind of weird thing where the gnome and the corner, for example, the grain is changing, but the position is changing. And what we're doing is we're really moving the next frame back into the previous frame's position. And we can overshoot it so you can really see it's taking those motion vectors and distorting it in that sort of parallaxed way. So it seems like we're moving the room. For this case, the magic number was 2. I have to say, motion vectors are rendered differently depending on the renderer. So that number might be different for a different type of renderer. But in this case, it's happening to work. So I've just lined them up, right? So I can see that most of the objects seem to be in the same place. So I know that's roughly the right number. So I'm going to duplicate that and put it on the previous frame. And if I set this to -2, so if I do the opposite, now if I look at the current frame and the previous frame, I've done the same thing. I've taken the previous frame and I've used the motion vectors to distort the pixels to pretend like they're in the position of the current frame. So what do we have now? I'm flipping between the results. So we have the current frame, the previous frame distorted to look like the current frame, and the next frame distorted back to look like the current frame. So we have things that are sort of overlapping, and most of the change now is the grain. And this is a sort of interesting situation because now that things are overlapping, we can start to do things like average the frames together, and that will average the grain together, but it'll leave the general shape of the objects because it wasn't a crazy camera move with lots of motion blur or parallax. And so in this case, with the subtle movement, it's going to help smooth out that grain. So for example, I could make a merge node, I could plug in a couple of these, and I could just set it to average. Okay, so this is the result of the averaging of the previous, current, and next frames together once they're distorted back into the current frame's position. And you can see that the noisiness has sort of largely been reduced. We are getting some weird artifacts around the edges, and that's because of the parallax. It doesn't really know what to do with that. But for surfaces that were not parallaxing, like the walls and the corners and the floor and the shadows, those are reduced in the noise now. There's another node that I like to use in these kind of situations, which is the blend. It's sort of like an average. So if I just plug in multiple things, you can start plugging in as many inputs as you want, and it starts to add. For example, I'll just add another one. It adds influence bars, so you can change how much each frame is influencing the averaged amount or the blended amount in this case. So it's not an exact average; it's like an average with weights, I guess. So this will give you pretty much the same type of situation as the average, but a little bit more control. And in this example, we had 3 frames averaged together, the current frame, the frame after, and the frame before. But we can, of course, do this with 5 frames. So the current frame and 1 and 2 frames ahead and 1 and 2 frames before. And instead of distorting it 2, we can move back 2 frames and distort it double that, so it would be from 2 to 4. And that'll try to move it back into the original position and of course give us more artifacts. So what you're looking at here is a 5 frame average, the current frame and 2 frames ahead and 2 frames before, so 5 frames in total. So it's averaging those 5 frames together and reducing the noise even farther. Now of course we're getting some fuzzy edges here and there, and that's always a problem with this method. So it depends on what you're actually trying to denoise. But for example, if you just had a room with a slow-moving camera and not many things parallaxing, this could be a great solution for you. Of course, if you have a moving character that's swinging his arms around and going over the background, this might not work as well. So it really depends on the situation. And of course, you can isolate certain areas that are working and get rid of other areas that are not working. Another node that you can add on top of this is called the temporal median. If you've ever used the regular median node, you know that it's taking the average of 1 pixel and all the pixels surrounding it. So it's taking the median of that. So I guess taking the pixels values, sorting them, and then giving you the one in the middle. And it's doing that spatially. So wherever 1 pixel is, it's doing that for all the pixels around it. But a temporal median will do a median on frames before and after it. So the current pixel, the same pixel on the next frame, and the same pixel on the frame before. It might have some pretty subtle results, but it helps smooth out some of that noise. So it's smoothing out for example, in the shadow area, and you can see it kind of working a little bit better to make the results smoother. So here's without the temporal median, and I'll slide it over, and here's with, and you should see that it's a little smoother, and maybe this is a good thing or maybe it's a bad thing. I suppose it's up to how much you want to smooth out and denoise your renders, but it is doing a level of smoothness to your geometry here. I should say that there's not too much settings going on with this temporal median. It's basically 1 is the most, and if you bring it down, it'll be a threshold and do it a bit less. So I just stuck it to 1 to give the full effect. So I'm going to move that example over to only affect the problem layers with the Motion Vector Denoise technique. So I have this affecting only the problem layers, and I'll do a before and after. So you can really see how much noise it's getting rid of. It's pretty nice. Just an alternative way to denoise something using a CG pass, a utility pass like the motion vectors. But yeah, you can see on this indirect pass exactly what you mean. They're almost hovering in place, like it's sort of a trippy look because the grain is almost frozen. It's not completely removed, but it's less chattering, and in some ways it preserves some details into the scene. Now this technique is going to fall apart a bit. It's going to work the best on the middle frames here, and it's going to not work so well in the beginning of the timeline and at the end of the timeline. And that's because it runs out of the before frames or the after frames. So at frame 1, it doesn't know what 2 frames before looks like, and at the end of the frame, the sequence, it doesn't know what 2 frames after looks like. So it's going to work the best when it has the proper amount of frames. It's just something to keep in mind if you try doing this on your CG renders. So as I was saying before, some companies have their own motion vector denoising tools. A couple that I found online on Nukepedia that are really useful are VectorMedian, and that's what we're looking at the result right here, is VectorMedian. The other one I found is called DeflickerVelocity, and it's also doing a pretty good job of accomplishing this effect. And they're just doing things that are a little bit more fancy than what I showed you, but using the same premise. So for example, VectorMedian is using, I believe, some blink scripts inside to do the math calculation. It's getting some better edges than say my technique that I showed had. I will link these two in the description, but here are the pages on Nukepedia. It's Deflicker with Velocity and VectorMedian. So you can download those and give those a try. I will say this is a really cool technique, and I think it has a lot of potential for more tool building. I haven't seen any kind of go-to one. It's always, whenever you remember this technique, you kind of have to re-remember the tool and fish for it out of your pocket or out of Nukepedia. So I guess this is a little bit of a challenge for the community. If anybody wants to take these principles and make some cooler tools to see the best results they can get, maybe that would always be a welcoming thing. But yeah, these do exist. Maybe check your company if you have one, or download these tools here, VectorMedian and DeflickerVelocity, or try building your own tool with sort of the method that I was giving and expanding on it. So there we have it. Those are the three kind of ways off the top of my head that usually we're using direct and indirect passes for: color correction and contrast, filters and effects, and probably most importantly, denoising the CG, because those are the noisy passes. Those are the ones that are expensive and will take the hit once the CG department is trying to speed up renders. So those are the ones that end up having to be fixed. I hope this was a useful video if you are new to the concept of direct and indirect, and if you already are familiar with it, I hope at least the denoising CG was interesting if you had never seen that before, or introducing you to that topic. So yeah, I'll end this video here and hope to see you in the next video.